The night Nathan Morgan's wagon axle snapped clean in two, he was 40 miles from anywhere that mattered, and the darkness around him was so complete he could not see his own hand in front of his face. He had been pushing the horses too hard, everyone told him so, and he had not listened, which was the kind of man he was in those days. The kind who ran from something he could not name and could not outpace no matter how many miles of Texas dust he put behind him. It was the spring of 1878, and the land between San Antonio and the small town of Hargrove Crossing was rough, unforgiving country, all mesquite scrub and caliche rock, the sort of terrain that punished carelessness the way a schoolmaster punished laziness, swiftly and without mercy. The crack had been tremendous, a sound like a rifle shot in the still night air, and the wagon had lurched so violently to the right that Nathan had nearly been thrown from the seat. He had wrestled the horses to a stop, climbed down in the dark, and run his hands along the wheel and axle until his fingers found the brake a clean fracture right at the housing. The wood split along the grain where it had been weakest all along. He had just never known it. He had a lantern in the wagon, but he had been economizing on oil, another decision that seemed foolish now in hindsight. He had perhaps a quarter-inch of oil left, enough to burn maybe 20 minutes if he was lucky. He lit it, surveyed the damage, and understood immediately that he was not going anywhere tonight. The spare axle he carried was secured under a canvas in the wagon bed, but without a proper jack and the right tools, setting a new axle in the pitch dark alone was not a task a man could reasonably accomplish. He had tried, in those first stubborn 20 minutes while the lantern burned, to at least loosen the wheel fittings and begin the process, and then the oil had guttered out and left him in complete darkness. He fed and watered the horses from the barrel he kept behind the seat, spoke to them quietly the way a man does when he wants to reassure himself as much as the animal, and then he climbed back onto the wagon seat, pulled his coat around him, and resigned himself to waiting for morning. He was asleep within 15 minutes. That was the other thing about Nathan Morgan in those days. He could sleep anywhere, through anything. The deep, hard sleep of a man who had learned long ago that exhaustion did not negotiate. What he did not know, could not have known, was that a farmstead sat no more than a quarter-mile off the road through a stand of cedar trees, invisible in the dark, and that the woman who lived there had seen his lantern from her window. Myrtle Talbot had not been sleeping. She rarely slept well anymore, and on this particular night she had been sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of chicory coffee gone cold, reading by the light of her own good lamp, listening to the spring wind move through the cedar brakes. She was 28 years old, a widow of 14 months, and she had been alone on this 40-acre spread since her husband James had died of a fever the previous winter. She had a mule named Biscuit, a milk cow named Patience, 12 chickens, a vegetable garden that was her great pride, and the kind of quiet competence that comes from having no choice but to be competent. She had seen the lantern moving on the road, seen it stop, seen it go dark. She had waited a reasonable interval to see if it moved again, and when it did not, she had put on her work coat, taken her own lantern, and gone to investigate. This was not recklessness on her part. She had lived in this country long enough to know that a stopped wagon on a dark road was almost always trouble of the mundane variety: a lame horse, a broken wheel, someone out of water. The dangerous men generally did not stop. The dangerous men kept moving. She found the wagon at the side of the road, 2 horses standing patiently in harness, and a man asleep on the seat with his hat pulled over his face. She held her lantern up and looked at the wagon, and she saw immediately what the problem was. She had grown up on a ranch in the hill country, the second of 6 children, and she had learned to work on wagons before she learned to read. Her father had believed that ignorance of practical matters was a form of poverty, and he had taught all his children accordingly, boys and girls alike. The axle was broken. The spare was right there in the wagon bed, which she could see plainly. The tools she would need were also in the wagon, in the wooden box bolted to the side. She could see the box, could see the latch was not locked. She looked at the sleeping man once more. He was tall, she could see that even folded up on the seat, long legs, broad shoulders under a canvas duster, a dark hat shielding his face. His breathing was slow and even. He was not going to wake up any time soon. Myrtle Talbot made a decision that would change her life, though she did not know it then. She went back to her farm, woke Biscuit the mule from a sound sleep. He was righteously displeased about this, and brought him out to the road with her wagon jack, which was a better one than most people carried because her husband James had been meticulous about equipment. Then she went to work. She worked by lantern light, and she worked quietly, and she worked with the unhurried efficiency of someone who knows exactly what she is doing. She jacked up the wagon on the broken side, removed the wheel, drew out the fractured axle, and set the spare. It took her the better part of 2 hours, and there was a moment in the middle of it when the jack slipped slightly and she held her breath and held the load and did not make a sound. The man on the seat above her did not stir. When she was done, the wheel was seated, the axle housing was tight, and the wagon sat level again on the road. She checked her work twice in the lantern light, the way her father had taught her to always check work twice, and then she loaded her jack back onto Biscuit, took her lantern, and walked home through the cedar trees without waking Nathan Morgan. She was back in her kitchen with a fresh cup of chicory coffee before first light. She did not think of it as anything remarkable. She thought of it as a neighbor helping a traveler, even if the traveler had not known he needed help. Nathan Morgan woke up when the sun was already 2 hands above the horizon, blinking in the morning light, stiff in every joint, confused about where he was, and then all at once remembering. He climbed down from the wagon seat fully prepared for a morning of difficult work, already running through the sequence of tasks in his mind, and stopped cold when he saw the wagon. It sat level. Both wheels were on the ground. He walked around it twice and then crouched down to look at the axle, and he saw the new wood, clean and pale against the road dust, and he saw the hardware seated properly, and he understood that someone had done this work in the night while he slept. He stood up slowly and looked around at the empty road, the cedar trees, the endless scrubland. There was no one. There were bootprints in the dust, small ones, he noticed, narrower than a man's, and the tracks of a mule and a wagon of some kind, coming from the direction of a gap in the cedar trees and returning the same way. He stood and looked at those tracks for a long moment. "What in the world?" he said to no one. He checked his horses, who had been unhitched from the traces at some point and rehitched, and who regarded him with the mild indifference of horses who have had a comfortable night. He found nothing missing, nothing disturbed. His rifle was still under the seat. His money belt was still around his waist. Whoever had done this had wanted nothing from him except apparently to see him on his way. He hitched up properly, climbed back to the seat, and sat there for a full 5 minutes looking at the gap in the cedar trees. A narrow path led through them, and somewhere beyond was whoever had done this work. He should have driven on. He had business in Hargrove Crossing, a land deal that had taken months to arrange, a meeting he could not miss. He was already later than he had planned. He drove through the cedar trees instead. The path opened into a small clearing, and there was a farmstead, a solid stone house, a good barn, a garden plot already showing green rows, a chicken yard, a mule regarding him suspiciously from a paddock. And on the porch, with a cup of something in her hand, was a woman. She was medium height with dark hair pulled back under a practical work bonnet, and she was wearing a brown work dress and leather gloves, and she looked at him with calm dark eyes as he pulled his wagon to a stop, and she did not seem particularly surprised to see him. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he said. He looked at her small boots. He looked at the mule in the paddock. He looked back at her. "Was it you?" She took a sip from her cup. "Did it hold up all right, the axle?" "Held up fine," he said. "Better than fine, that's a proper job." "The spare you had was good wood," she said. "You keep decent equipment, made it easier." He sat there on the wagon seat looking at her, and he had the peculiar sensation of being several degrees off balance, as though the world had tilted slightly while he was sleeping and had not righted itself yet. He was 32 years old, and he had met a great many people in his life, and he could not immediately think of one who had done something like this for him without waking him to receive thanks, or at minimum to receive payment. "I owe you," he said. "You don't," she said. "It wasn't any trouble. It was 2 hours of work in the dark," he said. "I can see the lamp oil you used on the housing." Her mouth curved slightly. "You're observant." "I'm a land surveyor," he said. "I make my living looking at things carefully." She studied him from the porch with those calm dark eyes, and he had the sense that she was measuring him with just as much precision as he was measuring anything. "Nathan Morgan," he said, because it occurred to him that he had not yet introduced himself, and his mother had raised him better than that. "Myrtle Talbot," she said. He climbed down from the wagon because it felt wrong to have this conversation from a height. He took off his hat when he reached the porch steps, and that surprised her. He could see it. Not many trail-worn men remembered their manners when they were surprised. "Mrs. Talbot," he said, "I am genuinely grateful." "It was a simple thing," she said. "It was not a simple thing," he said. "It was a considerable thing done quietly for a stranger." She looked at him for a moment, and something in her expression shifted just slightly, some small adjustment behind the eyes. "Would you like some coffee?" she said. "It's chicory, I'm afraid. I haven't been to town recently." "Chicory is fine," he said. He sat at her kitchen table and drank chicory coffee, and they talked for an hour. And he missed his meeting in Hargrove Crossing by half a day. And it turned out not to matter at all, because the man he was meeting was late himself, and everything was rescheduled. But when Nathan Morgan drove away from Myrtle Talbot's farmstead that morning, she did not give him her full address, only the general direction of where she was. And when he tried to remember afterward exactly how to find the path through the cedar trees, he found that his memory of the turns was uncertain. He had been somewhat distracted, it had to be admitted, by the woman with the calm dark eyes who repaired axles in the middle of the night as a form of neighborly courtesy. He thought about her all the way to Hargrove Crossing. He thought about the way she had said, "It wasn't any trouble," as though fixing a wagon axle by lamplight before dawn was simply what a person did. He thought about the garden with its neat rows and the solid stone house that she clearly maintained alone. He thought about the word widow, which she had mentioned once in passing, almost as an afterthought. "I manage this place alone since my husband passed, and I find I prefer to stay busy." And the way she had said it without self-pity or drama, the way you mention a fact about the weather. He finished his business in Hargrove Crossing in 4 days, and on the 5th day he drove back out on the road toward San Antonio and looked for the path through the cedar trees. He could not find it. He drove that stretch of road 3 times in both directions and could not identify the gap he had driven through. The cedar trees along that road all looked the same in the full light of day, close-growing, gray-green, impenetrable-looking, with no obvious path between them. He stopped twice and climbed down and walked along the tree line and found nothing. He felt foolish. He was a surveyor. He located things for a living, and he could not locate one farm that he had been to once. He drove on to San Antonio, telling himself it didn't matter, that a brief cup of chicory coffee with a stranger was nothing to turn around for. He told himself this with more emphasis than the situation probably warranted, which was a sign, if he had been paying attention to such signs. He was back in his office in San Antonio by that evening, and he sat at his desk and tried to focus on the survey map spread across it. And instead he found himself thinking about a woman who fixed broken wagon axles in the dark and was gone before a man woke up, as though she had never been there at all. Nathan Morgan had been a widower himself for 3 years. His wife Caroline had died in childbirth along with their son, and he had responded to this catastrophe by working without cease, moving himself around the state of Texas on one survey job after another, staying busy in the same way Myrtle Talbot had said she preferred to stay busy, though he had not recognized the similarity until this moment, sitting at his desk in San Antonio, and the recognition unsettled him considerably. He was not a man who believed in fate or signs or any of the romantic nonsense that filled the dime novels his sister was always reading. He was a practical man, a man of measurements and recorded observations, a man who believed in what could be verified and set down. And yet, he pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and wrote down everything he could remember about where the Talbot farm was, the distance from Hargrove Crossing, the approximate mile marker on the road, the quality of the soil around the cedar brake, the direction of the morning light when he had driven through. He worked from these notes the way he would work a survey problem methodically, building from what was known. He had a job to do. He would do it. And then, when that was done, he would find Myrtle Talbot and thank her properly, because that was the right thing to do, and the rightness of it had nothing to do with the fact that he had thought about her every day since he'd left. He believed this for approximately 4 days, and then he admitted to himself, alone in his room at the boarding house where he kept permanent lodging, that he wanted to find her for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with thank you notes. The survey job he had taken was mapping the boundary disputes around a stretch of ranch land south of San Antonio, and it was work that required his full attention because boundary disputes had a tendency to become violent if the surveyor made mistakes. He threw himself into it with the focus that grief had taught him, measuring twice, recording carefully, making sure his figures were correct. In the evenings he asked questions. He was discreet about it, because he did not want to seem like a man hunting a woman, which was a thing that could be misunderstood. He asked about the area between San Antonio and Hargrove Crossing, about the farms and ranches in that stretch of country, about who had settled there and when. He mentioned in passing that he had broken down out on that road some weeks back and a neighbor had helped him, and he wanted to send his regards, and did anyone know the farms out that way? He got fragments. There was a widow woman out on the Cedar Creek Road, someone said, a Mrs. Talbot kept her farm upright, had been there 3 or 4 years with her husband before he died. Nobody was sure what she would do now. She was a capable woman by all accounts. She had come from hill country originally, someone else said, had a family over near Careville. She went to town in Hargrove Crossing on the first Saturday of the month, generally for supplies. First Saturday of the month. He looked at his calendar. The first Saturday of next month was 23 days away. He spent those 23 days finishing the survey job, which he completed with his usual precision. He settled his accounts, wrote up his report, and delivered it to the rancher who had hired him, a large sunburned man named Garfield Price, who shook his hand with enough force to rearrange his fingers and declared the work satisfactory. Nathan collected his fee, secured his instruments, and drove north toward Hargrove Crossing with 3 days to spare before the first Saturday. He used those 3 days to do some legitimate work in the area. There was always legitimate work for a surveyor in a growing territory, and he stayed at the Hargrove Crossing Hotel, which was a building that aspired toward the title of hotel while achieving something closer to a well-maintained barn with beds, and he waited. He told himself, as he waited, that she might not come to town, that she might have gone to a different town, that she might be away visiting family, that he might have misremembered the information entirely. He constructed a careful architecture of alternate possibilities around himself, because he was a practical man who did not believe in romantic nonsense, and all of this preparation of alternatives meant that, when he walked out onto the main street of Hargrove Crossing on a warm Saturday morning in late April of 1878 and saw Myrtle Talbot tying her mule's reins to the post outside the general store, he stood on the boardwalk for a full 10 seconds and did absolutely nothing. Because he had been so thoroughly prepared for her not to be there, that her actual presence had temporarily overwhelmed his capacity for action. She was wearing a blue dress he had not seen before, and her dark hair was pinned up under a straw hat, and she was checking something on a list she carried, and she had not seen him yet. He walked across the street. "Mrs. Talbot," he said. She looked up from her list, and he saw recognition move across her face, followed by something that might have been surprise, and then that settled into the composed expression he remembered from her porch. But her eyes were warmer than composed, he noticed, if you were paying attention. He was paying attention. "Mr. Morgan," she said, "you found your way to town." "I had some work in the area," he said, which was technically true and also not the whole truth, and from the slight elevation of her eyebrow he suspected she understood this. "I wondered if I might help you carry your supplies." She looked at him steadily. "I've been carrying my own supplies for some time now," she said. "I know it," he said. "I was asking if you'd allow me to, not suggesting you required the help." There was a beat of silence, then the corner of her mouth moved. "Fair point," she said. "All right." They walked into the general store together, and Nathan Morgan learned a great deal about Myrtle Talbot in the next hour simply by watching her transact her business. She knew exactly what she needed, had a written list and prices already estimated in her head, and she negotiated with the store owner, a round-faced man named Beckwith, with a quiet firmness that did not permit itself to be deflected. When Beckwith told her the price of lamp oil had gone up 2 cents, she told him calmly that the store in Junction City was charging the old price, and she supposed she would make the drive if that was how things stood. The price did not go up. "You know the price in Junction City?" Nathan asked quietly as they moved to the dry goods. "I know prices," she said. "It's important to know prices." "Do you actually go to Junction City?" "I have once." But Beckwith doesn't know how often. She glanced at him sidelong, and there was humor in it, dry and clear as creek water. Nathan carried her supplies to her wagon and loaded them without asking, and she let him without protesting, and he thought this was some kind of progress, though he could not have explained exactly in what direction. When everything was loaded, she untied the mule's reins and stood for a moment looking at him. "You drove back out and looked for my farm, didn't you?" she said. It was not quite a question. He decided not to insult her by lying. "I did," he said, "twice." "The path is easy to miss in daylight," she said. "The cedars close it up." "I noticed that," he said, "after I'd been looking for 2 hours." She looked at him in that measuring way. "Why were you looking for it?" He thought about giving her a practical answer to pay her for her labor, to return the wagon jack she had used, something of that kind. He had a feeling she would see through any practical answer he offered, because she was that sort of woman. He took his hat off instead, which had become something he apparently did when he was talking to Myrtle Talbot, and he said, "I wanted to see you again." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable exactly, but it was full of something: assessment, consideration, the weighing of things. "I am a widow, Mr. Morgan," she said finally. "Not quite a year and a half past my husband's death. I say that not to discourage you, but because I think you should know where I stand." "That's fair," he said. "I was a widower myself 3 years past. I say that not to draw a parallel, but because I think you should know where I stand." She studied him. "You're a surveyor." "I am." "You travel a great deal." "I do. It's the nature of the work." He paused. "Though I have been thinking about taking on more permanent work. The county offices have been wanting a permanent county surveyor for some time now. It would mean staying in one place." He had not known he was going to say that until he said it. And once he'd said it, he realized it was true. He had been thinking about it in the abstract without quite knowing why. He looked at her and he thought perhaps he knew why now. "I see," she said, which told him nothing and also told him everything, because she was the kind of woman who would tell him nothing until she was certain, and that was the right way to be. He respected it enormously. "Would you have dinner with me?" he asked. "There's a restaurant of sorts on the next street. I cannot vouch for the quality of the food." "I've eaten there," she said. "The beef stew is acceptable." "Then would you have acceptable beef stew with me?" She was quiet for a moment longer. Then she tied the mule back to the post. "All right," she said. They sat in the small restaurant on the side street, which was run by a Mexican woman named Señora Delgado, who had come north from across the border years before, and had built herself a solid business feeding ranch hands and travelers and the occasional surveyor. The beef stew was indeed acceptable, and the cornbread was better than acceptable, and Nathan Morgan ate good food, and talked with Myrtle Talbot for 2 hours and came away knowing the following things. She was the daughter of a rancher named Robert Talbot from the hill country near Careville. She had taken her husband's name, but it happened to also be her family name, a coincidence she found mildly amusing. Her husband James had been a good man. She said this simply and without excessive grief. A farmer who had worked hard and died too young of a fever that no one had been able to cure. She had considered going back to her family after his death but had decided against it, because the farm was hers and she had worked to build it, and she did not want to be someone's dependent when she was perfectly capable of being her own person. She could read and write and cipher, which was not universal among women in that country in that year, and she had opinions about things like crop rotation and water rights, and the treatment of the Comanche people who had been forcibly removed from the land that everyone around her was now farming, and she stated those opinions directly without apology. "Do you think that was unjust?" he asked, about the Comanche, because he wanted to know how she thought about things like that. "I think it was a terrible injustice," she said, without hesitation. "I think we are all of us living on land that was taken, and most people prefer not to think about it. And I understand why they prefer not to think about it, but I don't think preferring not to think about it makes it less true." He sat with that for a moment. "I agree with you," he said. She looked at him as though that surprised her, and he understood that she had expected either agreement that was too easy or pushback that was defensive, and he had apparently given her neither, and she was recalibrating slightly. "Most men don't say that so plainly," she said. "I'm a surveyor," he said. "My job is to say what is, plainly and without bias. I try to apply that generally." "That must be useful," she said, and there was warmth in it. He told her about himself, about growing up in Virginia, about coming west at 22 because the East felt too small, about learning surveying from an old man in Tennessee who had believed that the ability to measure land precisely was the closest thing to justice the frontier had to offer. He told her about Caroline briefly and honestly, the way she had told him about James, a good person, gone too young, a grief that had shaped him in ways he was still learning to understand. He did not dramatize it. He thought she would not want him to. When they walked out of Senora Delgado's restaurant and back onto the street, the sun was beginning to move toward late afternoon, and Myrtle looked at the angle of the light and said she needed to be getting back before dark. "May I call on you?" he asked. He felt somewhat formal asking it, but it seemed the right way to ask. She looked at him steadily. "I am not opposed to that," she said, which from Myrtle Talbot he was beginning to understand was a form of warmth. "Next Saturday?" he asked. "Next Saturday," she said. He watched her drive the mule wagon down the main street of Hargrove Crossing and turn onto the road toward home, and he stood on the boardwalk with his hat in his hand, and felt something he had not felt in 3 years, something he had half believed he would not feel again, the specific, warm, slightly terrifying feeling of anticipating another person. He rode out to her farm the following Saturday, having gotten precise directions from a rancher named Emmett Cook, who turned out to know the Cedar Creek road well, and who gave him exact landmarks. He found the path through the cedar trees without difficulty this time. It was indeed narrow and easy to miss at speed, but obvious when you were looking for it carefully, which Nathan Morgan intended from now on to be doing. She was in the garden when he arrived, on her knees between rows of beans, and she looked up at the sound of hoofbeats and stood and brushed soil from her hands with the matter-of-fact quality of someone who is not embarrassed to be caught working. She was wearing her work clothes again, the brown dress and leather gloves, and her hair was coming loose from its pins, and she was entirely beautiful in the morning light in a way that had nothing to do with artifice and everything to do with the fact that she was fully, completely herself. He brought her a small packaged lamp oil, because she had used hers on his axle repair, and he had been thinking about this since the day he'd noticed the lamp oil on the housing. It was a practical gift, not a romantic one, and he had spent some time deciding whether to bring it or something different, and had concluded that Myrtle Talbot would likely appreciate a practical gift more than roses, even if roses grew in this country, which they largely did not outside of carefully tended gardens. She took the lamp oil with an expression that was almost surprised, as though she had not expected him to have remembered that detail, and then she said, "Thank you." That was thoughtful, and the straightforwardness of it meant more than elaborate thanks would have. He stayed for most of the day. They walked her fence line because a section needed checking, and he noted the damage and helped her repair it, because he carried tools and because it would have been strange to stand and watch while she worked. They ate a midday meal at her kitchen table, beans and corn bread and sliced salt pork, good plain food, and they talked about everything and nothing, about weather and water tables, and whether the town of Hargrove Crossing was going to get a proper doctor any time soon, about the books she kept on a small shelf by the window, a Bible, a farming almanac, a battered copy of David Copperfield, and 2 or 3 others he did not recognize. "You read Dickens," he said. "My mother thought reading novels was frivolous," she said. "My father thought anything that made you better at understanding people was useful. My father won." He came back the next Saturday and the one after that. By the 4th Saturday he was coming on Wednesdays too, and no one had formally proposed this arrangement. It had simply evolved, the way useful things do, out of the plain fact that they both wanted it. He helped with things that needed doing on the farm. She fed him meals that were better than anything he could prepare himself. They talked endlessly and easily about everything, and in between talking they were comfortable being quiet, which Nathan Morgan had not had with another person in a very long time and which he valued perhaps more than the talking. She was careful, he noticed. She was warm and she was interested, and she let him in by degrees, like a person opening a window a little at a time to let in air, checking each time whether the air was good before opening it further. He respected this deeply. He did not push. He was there consistently every Wednesday and every Saturday, reliable as a fixed star, and he thought this was probably what she needed to see, not grand gestures, but consistency. There was an afternoon in early May, the 5th or 6th week of his visits, when a storm came in fast from the southwest, the way Texas storms do, without adequate warning, and they were in the barn together checking on the horses when the sky went green, and the wind picked up and the rain came sideways and hard. They stood in the barn doorway watching it come, closed together because the doorway was narrow and the rain was blowing in, and he was aware of her warmth against his arm with a physical clarity that made it difficult to think about weather. "I love a good storm," she said. She said it simply, as a statement of fact about herself. "I've learned to respect them," he said. "That's different from loving them." "I suppose it is." He looked at her profile. "What do you love?" he asked, and then thought this might be too large a question for a barn doorway during a rainstorm, but she did not seem to think so. She was quiet for a moment, watching the rain sheet across her garden. "The smell of soil after rain," she said. "The first green of spring, solving a problem that seemed unsolvable, bread coming out of the oven right, the particular quiet of this place at night." She paused. "What do you love?" He thought about it honestly, the way she always seemed to invite. "The moment a boundary line resolves," he said. "When the measurements all align and the map makes sense. Riding early in the morning before the heat comes. A conversation that goes where it wants to go." He looked at her. "This," he said, meaning the conversation, meaning the barn, meaning all of it, and he let the word stand there without qualifying it. She looked at him, and he saw something move behind her eyes, something opening, and then the thunder rolled over them like a wave and the horses shifted and they both stepped back from the doorway, and the moment passed into something else. But it did not go away. It settled instead like something that had been decided. On a Saturday at the end of May, he arrived at her farm to find her in a difficult mood, not with him, he sensed immediately, but with something else, something that had preceded him. He tied his horse and walked to the porch, and she was sitting with a letter in her hand, and she looked up when he came, and her expression was the determined kind that people get when they are managing something hard. "Trouble," he said. "My brother-in-law," she said. James's brother Clarence. He's written to say that he believes the farm should rightfully be part of the Talbot family estate, and that I ought to sell it and distribute the proceeds." She said this calmly, but there was a current under the calm that was anger or something close to it. Nathan sat down in the other porch chair. "Is there any legal basis for that claim?" "None whatsoever," she said. "The deed is in my name. It was put in my name when we filed it. James insisted on it because he said it only made sense given that I managed the accounts. Clarence knows this perfectly well. He just thought—" She stopped and compressed her lips for a moment. "He thought that without James here I would be easier to push." Nathan looked at her steadily. "Would you like me to write to him?" She looked at him sharply. "Why would you write to him?" "Because I'm a county surveyor," he said, "and I know land law in this state in considerable detail, and a letter from a county surveyor laying out the relevant statutes might carry more weight than a letter from you which is unjust but true." She stared at him. He waited. "Yes," she said finally. "I would like that very much, actually." He wrote the letter that afternoon at her kitchen table, drawing on his knowledge of Texas property law and the specific statutes protecting a woman's right to hold property in her own name. And he was precise and thorough, and gave Clarence Talbot absolutely no angle to argue from. Myrtle read it over his shoulder, and when he was finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You wrote any claim to the contrary would be frivolous and vexatious. Can you say that in a legal letter?" "I just did," he said. She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh fully, not the small, dry humor he had seen before, but a real laugh, and it was wonderful. It transformed her face entirely, opened it up, and she looked younger and lighter and entirely delighted. He was absolutely, completely, beyond any reasonable argument, in love with her. He had known it was coming, the way you know a summer storm is coming when the light changes and the air pressure drops. He had been watching it approach for weeks, but the laugh was the moment it arrived, standing directly overhead, and there was no point in pretending otherwise. He did not say so, not that day. It was too soon, and she was still measuring him, and he was a man who believed in getting measurements right, but something changed after the letter. He saw it in small things. She called him Nathan without the Mr., and it had been a while, but now it was consistent. She poured his coffee without asking how he wanted it, because she had noticed. When he arrived, she did not keep him on the porch but brought him inside immediately, into the kitchen that was the center of the house, and there was a rightness about being in that kitchen that he felt in his chest. One Wednesday afternoon in June, he was helping her with the vegetable garden weeding, a task he was less skilled at than she was but was willing to do, and her neighbor rode over, a rancher named Harlan Stokes who had a spread about 2 miles east, and who was a decent enough man in the way that many men in that country were decent, meaning he meant well and did not think sufficiently about the effect of his words on other people. Stokes looked at Nathan in the garden and at Myrtle and said, with transparent approbation, "Good to see you got yourself some help out here, Mrs. Talbot. About time you had a man around the place." There was a pause. Nathan did not look at Myrtle. He concentrated on the weed in his hand. "Mr. Morgan is a friend who is visiting," Myrtle said, her voice exactly level. "He is kind enough to help when he's here. Though I should point out, Mr. Stokes, that I have managed this farm adequately without a man around the place for 14 months now." Stokes had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Meant no offense, Mrs. Talbot." "None taken," she said, which was polite enough to let him feel forgiven and not quite warm enough to invite him to do it again. After Stokes had ridden on, Nathan waited a moment and then said, "I'm sorry if my being here causes talk." "There will be talk regardless," she said. "People will talk about a widow woman either way. If she's alone, she's an object of pity. If she has company, it's of questionable propriety. I stopped worrying about it." She pulled a weed with perhaps slightly more force than necessary. "Though I am entirely able to manage without a man around the place." "I know it," he said. "You fixed my axle in the dark." She looked up at him, and there it was again, the warmth, the humor, something softer underneath. "I did," she said. "That's the most competent single thing anyone has ever done for me," he said. She went back to weeding, but she was smiling and she let him see it. The summer deepened. Nathan took the county surveyor position in early June, signing the official papers in the county offices in Hargrove, crossing with the county clerk, a nearsighted man named Pemberton, who shook his hand with enthusiasm and declared that having a surveyor of his caliber in permanent residence was a great benefit to the county. Nathan accepted the compliment modestly and did not mention that his reasons for wanting a permanent position had evolved considerably since he had first considered the idea in abstract. He found himself a proper house in Hargrove Crossing, a small but solid limestone house on the edge of town, with a good well and a shed for his horses and room for a proper survey office. He set it up carefully, with an attention to detail that he had not applied to any of his previous living arrangements, all of which had been temporary by design. He bought furniture, a proper bed, a good table, bookshelves that he immediately began to fill with the books he had been carting around in the wagon for years. He told Myrtle about the house on a Wednesday visit, and she said, "Show me." And so he drove her to town on the following Saturday and showed her the house, walking her through each room while she looked at everything with the practiced eye of a woman who had built and maintained a home. "The kitchen wants a proper larder," she said. "That shelf is insufficient." "I was thinking of adding one," he said. "And the east window needs a shutter. The afternoon sun will bake this room in July." "I hadn't thought of that." "You're right." She stood in the main room with the good afternoon light coming through the windows and looked around with that expression he had come to know, the one that meant she was thinking something she had not yet decided to say. He waited. "It's a good house," she said finally. "It has the bones of a good house." "That's all I need," he said. "I can build on good bones." She looked at him, and they both understood, he thought, that they were not entirely talking about the house. It was late June when he told her he loved her. He had not planned it precisely. He had been planning it in the abstract for weeks, turning over the timing, the setting, the words, in the way he planned surveys, carefully and with attention to every variable. And then one evening he was sitting on her porch with her, watching the last light go out of the sky over the cedar trees, and she said something about how the evenings were her favorite time of day now because they felt less lonely than they used to, and she said it quietly and without looking at him, and it was so honest and so contained, so characteristic of her, that he set down his coffee cup and said it. "Myrtle, I love you." She was quiet for a very long moment. The last light was golden on the cedar trees, and the first stars were beginning to show, and somewhere in the brush a mockingbird was cycling through its repertoire with the tireless enthusiasm of its kind. "Nathan," she said, and stopped. "You don't need to say anything right now," he said. "I'm not asking for anything. I thought you should know." She turned and looked at him, and her eyes were bright in the evening light, and she said, "I know that I have feelings for you that I was not expecting to have again. I know that I am cautious. I know that I am still learning to trust this." "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." She reached out and put her hand over his, on the arm of the porch chair, and left it there. And that was more eloquent than a great deal of words. He drove home in the dark that night with her hand's warmth still on his, and the mockingbird still going at full volume somewhere in the cedar trees, and he felt as light as he had felt in years. July brought heat that was spectacular even by Texas standards, the kind of heat that bleaches the color out of the sky and makes the air above the road shimmer in silver waves. Nathan spent his weekdays on survey work, mapping a disputed boundary southeast of town, which required hours in the sun with his transit and chain, and a note-taker he hired from the town, a young Mexican man named Pablo who was quick with figures and reliable, and who Nathan paid fairly, which was not always the case for such work in that time and place, and Nathan knew it. He talked to Pablo sometimes, on the drives out to the survey sites, about what it was like to work in the county. Pablo said carefully that it depended on who you worked for, and Nathan said he understood, and tried to make sure that his own dealings were the kind that didn't add to the weight Pablo was already carrying. He couldn't fix the whole of it. The injustices were built into the structure of things in ways no single surveyor could dismantle. But he could be decent in his own sphere, and he was. On Saturdays he was at Myrtle's farm, and on Wednesdays. Her farm was thriving in the summer heat. Her garden was extraordinary. She had clearly worked it with enormous skill and attention, and the green rows of beans, squash, sweet corn, tomatoes, and peppers were a remarkable thing in that landscape of scrub and rock. She sold surplus at the Hargrove crossing market once a month, which was both practically valuable and a source of evident satisfaction. He helped her haul water from the creek during a dry spell in mid-July, and they worked together through the hottest part of the day without complaint, because what else do you work? He noticed in these working hours that they operated together with an easiness that felt old, that felt like something that had been happening for years rather than months. They did not get in each other's way. They did not need to explain things twice. He handed her tools before she asked for them, and she knew when he needed to be left alone with a problem and when he wanted to think out loud. And he could not have said how these things had developed because they had developed the way all important things develop, gradually and without announcement. She kissed him for the first time in the late afternoon of the third Saturday in July, and it was entirely her initiative, which was so characteristic of her that he almost laughed. He had been rebuilding a section of her barn wall that had started to come loose. He had brought lumber from town and had been working on it for most of the afternoon, and he had just finished, and he was hot and dusty and probably not at his most appealing, and he turned from the wall to find her standing close behind him with 2 cups of water, and she held one out to him, and when he took it their hands overlapped for a moment, and she looked at him. And then she stood up on her toes and kissed him, quick and warm and definite. He set the cup down very carefully on the fence rail and kissed her back, and that was somewhat less quick. They stood in the shade of the barn in the late July heat, and she rested her forehead against his shoulder and he held her, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the chickens moved around in the yard behind them with their usual supreme indifference to human emotional moments, and a hawk circled over the cedar brake, and the world was entirely ordinary and entirely transformed. "I love you," she said, into his shoulder. Said it quietly, the way she said things she had thought about for a long time. "I should have said it sooner." "You said it now," he said. She pulled back and looked at him with those steady dark eyes. "I want us to be sensible about this," she said. "I'm a surveyor," he said. "I'm constitutionally incapable of not being sensible. I want to keep my farm," she said. "I want you to understand that I built this place. It belongs to me and I intend to keep it." "Of course," he said without hesitation. "I would not suggest otherwise. Some men would find that arrangement unusual." "Some men are fools," he said. "Keeping your farm makes practical sense. The county surveyor office is in town. Your farm is out here. You could keep it for the house and the garden and the livestock and come to town when you choose, or I could come here when I can," or he stopped. "I'm planning too far ahead." "No," she said. "You're planning sensibly." "I like sensible," a pause, "and I like you." "Considerably?" he asked. "Considerably," she said, and he saw the smile she was keeping from fully forming, and he found that almost more affecting than if she had let it. He proposed to her in August, on a Saturday evening in her kitchen, which was entirely the right place to do it. He did not get down on one knee, not because he wasn't prepared to, but because he had tried to imagine how Myrtle Talbot would react to that, and had concluded that while she would be gracious about it, she would also probably find it excessive. He sat across the kitchen table from her while she was pouring the after-supper coffee, and he said her name, and she looked up and he said, "I want to marry you. I want to be your husband. I want to spend the rest of my life driving out on this road on Saturdays and Wednesdays and any other day I can manage it, and working beside you and talking with you and being in this kitchen and building something with you. I want that more than I have wanted anything in a long time. Will you marry me?" She set the coffee pot down very precisely. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at him in the way that was her particular way of considering things, full and serious and honest. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Nathan." They were married in September 1878 in the small Methodist church in Hargrove Crossing, with the Reverend Abbot presiding and approximately 40 people in attendance, including Myrtle's parents, Robert and Henrietta Talbot, who came up from Careville by wagon, and pronounced Nathan adequate upon first meeting and satisfactory upon closer inspection, which Nathan understood was something close to high praise from a man of Robert Talbot's economy with compliments. Her brother Samuel and his wife Mary came too, and her younger sister Clara, who was 17 and looked at the whole proceedings with bright-eyed romantic attention, and Harlan Stokes the neighbor came and apologized, quietly and genuinely, for his earlier comment about having a man around the place, and Nathan told him it was forgotten, which it was. Pablo came with his wife Lucia, and Nathan was glad to see them there, in the church alongside everyone else, without the separateness that was so often forced on people in that time and that place. Not everyone approved, Nathan noticed, but he was beyond caring much about that approval. Emmett Cook, the rancher who had given him directions to the Cedar Creek road all those months ago, shook Nathan's hand afterward and said, "Took you long enough?" And Nathan acknowledged that it had, and Emmett said, "Some things are worth the time," and Nathan said, "This one certainly was." They had the reception at Senora Delgado's restaurant, which the Senora had closed to other customers for the afternoon, and decorated with a quantity of paper flowers that transformed it entirely, and she cooked enough food for 3 times the number of people present, and declared it a point of honor that no one was going home hungry. Nathan ate 2 helpings of the beef stew that had been present at what he privately thought of as their first real conversation, and when he told Senora Delgado this, she was delighted and produced a 3rd helping that he had not asked for but found he could manage. Myrtle, beside him at the table, said quietly, "3 helpings of beef stew at your own wedding reception. That's going to be what people remember." "Let them remember it," he said. "I'm happy." She looked at him, and the warmth in her eyes was so clear and so full that he thought he would carry it with him for the rest of his life like a lamp. They went home to his limestone house in Hargrove Crossing that night, their house now, and they had a life together to begin. The arrangement they had discussed worked exactly as they had said it would, practically and well. Myrtle kept her farm, riding out 2 or 3 times a week to tend the garden and the animals, and Nathan came when he could, and on other days she was at the house in town, and the house filled up quickly with the evidence of 2 people who were fully themselves. Her bookshelves joining his, her kitchen organization transforming the kitchen into something that actually functioned. Her mule Biscuit residing in Nathan's shed, alongside his horses, with a degree of tolerant coexistence that Nathan thought was a reasonable model for any household. She found work for herself in Hargrove Crossing that she had not had before. Her knowledge of plants and remedies was considerable, accumulated from years of farming and her mother's teaching, and the doctor, when he eventually came to town, a young man named Dr. Everett Marsh, fresh from medical school in Nashville, who was earnest and sometimes out of his depth in the practical knowledge of frontier illness, found Myrtle's knowledge useful and said so plainly. And they developed a working relationship of mutual respect, which Nathan thought Myrtle deserved and was glad to see her receive. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was cold and long, and they settled into each other and into their shared life with the ease of 2 people who had been shaped by difficulty into something flexible and strong. There were arguments because they were both people with opinions, and the arguments were honest and sometimes heated and always resolved, because they were both also people who did not hold things, who believed in clearing the air and moving forward. They learned each other in all the ordinary ways, the morning habits and the evening habits, and the things that required patience and the things that could be shared without negotiation. And every ordinary thing felt, to to Nathan, like a gift he had not known he had been waiting for. One cold January evening he came home from a long day of winter survey work. There was always work. The county was growing. Land was being registered and disputed and measured at a constant rate, and found her at the kitchen table with the lamp lit and a book in her hands. And she looked up when he came in and smiled, and that was all, that one ordinary moment, and he stopped in the doorway for a second just to hold it. "You're letting the cold in," she said. He came inside and shut the door. She was pregnant by spring, and they were both happy in a way that had a particular quality to it, careful happiness, the kind that has been tempered by loss and knows not to take itself for granted, the kind that looks at good fortune steadily rather than looking away. She continued her farm work through the pregnancy with the practicality that was her nature, modifying what needed modifying and refusing to be treated as an invalid, which she communicated to Dr. Marsh with a directness that he, to his credit, accepted and adapted to. Nathan drove out to the farm with her and drove her home, and he did not hover, he knew better than to hover, but he was paying attention always, and she knew it and let herself take comfort in it. Their son was born in October 1879 in the limestone house in Hargrove Crossing, with Dr. Marsh attending and Myrtle's mother Henrietta having come up from Careville the week before, characteristically organized. He came into the world on a cool fall afternoon, announced his presence with considerable volume, and was placed in Nathan's arms while Dr. Marsh and Henrietta attended to Myrtle, and Nathan stood holding this small, furious person and felt something crack open in his chest that he had not known was sealed. He had not been able to hold his first child. That child had not lived, had come too early and gone too quickly, and he had carried that absence for 3 years like a stone in his pocket. He had not realized until this moment, holding this son who was alive and loud and present, how heavy the stone had been. He looked at Myrtle, who was watching him from the bed with exhaustion and love in equal parts, and he said, "He's perfect," and she said, "Of course he is." And it was so entirely like her to say that, so confident and dry and warm, that he laughed, actually laughed in the middle of everything. They named him James Robert Morgan James for Myrtle's first husband, because he had been a good man and deserved to be remembered, and Robert for her father, because Robert Talbot had come to seem to Nathan like the father he would have chosen for himself, if fathers were choosable. It was Myrtle's idea, and Nathan had agreed immediately, because it was entirely the right thing to do, and she was the one who would have known how to do it right. James Robert Morgan was an excellent baby by any measure, healthy, strong, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's length of limb, and an evident opinion about most things from the very beginning, which neither of his parents found surprising. He grew up surrounded by books and gardens and survey maps, and the clear, steady presence of two people who loved each other, and showed it in practical, consistent ways, and who told him the truth about things. In the spring of 1881, when James was 18 months old and very much in the business of exploring the entire perimeter of whatever space he was placed in, they had a second child, a daughter this time, born in the same limestone house on a May morning when the cedar trees were blooming, and Biscuit the mule was raising a racket in the shed about something only he could perceive. They named her Clara Rose Clara for Myrtle's younger sister, who had grown into a fine young woman and was herself recently married, and Rose because Myrtle had finally succeeded in getting climbing roses to grow on the south wall of the farmhouse, which she had been attempting for 2 years, and it had seemed like a sign. Clara Rose Morgan was a person of such determined personality from approximately her 4th day of life that Nathan, watching her from across the kitchen while she lay in her basket regarding the ceiling with an expression of profound assessment, said, "She's already measuring the room." "She takes after her father," Myrtle said. "I think she takes after her mother," he said. "Her father measures the room carefully and then does the thing. She looks like she's measuring the room and writing a list of improvements." Myrtle laughed, that full, real laugh that still transformed her face. "You might be right," she said. The farm on Cedar Creek became something of a joint enterprise over those years. Nathan's county work meant he had useful connections with the county water board and the land registry, and Myrtle's farm benefited from this in practical ways. Better water rights documentation, a boundary dispute with a neighboring property that Nathan resolved cleanly, and without the nastiness it might have become. The farm itself expanded slightly when the land to the east came available, and Myrtle bought it, carefully and after research, and added a proper apple orchard that she planned with the same thoroughness she planned everything. She hired Lucia, Pablo's wife, to help with the kitchen garden when the orchard work got intensive, and the two women worked together with a mutual respect and genuine warmth that Nathan was glad to see, and that extended naturally to a friendship between the families. Sunday dinners that moved between the two houses, children running around yards together, the ordinary beautiful integration that was possible when people chose it. It was not always easy in that time and that place, but it was chosen consistently and it held. Robert Talbot came up from Careville twice a year and inspected the farm and the house and the children and Nathan with equal thoroughness, and his annual verdict grew warmer by degrees until the year he arrived and said, unprompted, sitting on the porch of the farmhouse in the Cedar Creek evening, "You're a good husband, Nathan, a good father. My daughter chose well." He said it the way he said all things, simply, without decoration as a fact. And Nathan, who had spent a considerable portion of his adulthood feeling uncertain about what he was and whether he was enough, found that he received this simple fact as the extraordinary gift it was. "I know I did," he said, and meant it in every direction. He had chosen well too, and he knew it. Myrtle's dispute with Clarence Talbot, James's brother, had ended definitively and permanently with Nathan's letter in the summer of 1878, as predicted. Clarence had written one more letter attempting a different angle, and Nathan had written back citing 3 additional statutes and suggesting that if Clarence wished to pursue the matter, the county court was available, and the fee for filing a frivolous claim was substantial. Clarence had not written again. Nathan occasionally wondered if he had done the right thing. It was, after all, Myrtle's fight to have. But Myrtle had told him plainly that the only regret she had was not having thought of it herself, and that had settled it. The cedar trees along the road continued to close the path in summer and let the light through in winter, and Nathan learned the path by heart, every twist of it, the way you learn the lines of someone's face. He could drive it in the dark if he needed to. He had driven it in the dark once, coming back late from a county board meeting that had run considerably over time, and the path through the trees had been familiar under the wheels the way a home is familiar, not because you can see it, but because you know it. He thought about that sometimes. The path he had found again and again, through darkness and unfamiliar terrain, the axle that had brought him here. The woman who had seen his lantern from her window and gone out in the dark with a wagon jack, and repaired what was broken while he slept, and then gone home without waking him, as though it were simply what you did for a stranger on the road. He thought about it one evening in the fall of 1882, when James was 3 years old and Clara was 18 months, and the house in town and the farm on Cedar Creek were both full and warm and good. He and Myrtle were sitting on the farmhouse porch in the early evening, the children inside with Henrietta who had come for a visit, the cedar trees dark and fragrant in the cooling air. The first stars were coming out. The mockingbird was going somewhere as it always was. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You don't usually ask permission," she said. "This one I'm asking permission." She turned to look at him, curious. "That night," he said, "when you fixed the axle, why did you leave before I woke?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the cedar trees. "I thought about waking you," she said, "but you were sleeping so deeply. You looked like you needed it," a pause, "and I wasn't looking for thanks. I didn't need anything from you. I just wanted the thing to be fixed." "That's it," she considered. I think I was also, it was the middle of the night and I was a widow woman alone and the road wasn't a safe place to be introducing myself to a strange man. I did the sensible thing and went home. Very sensible, he said. I thought so. And yet, he said, I spent a month finding you. She looked at him sidelong. I know it, she said. I didn't expect that. No, no, she paused. I didn't think anyone would look. He sat with that for a moment. The mockingbird called in the cedar brake. The evening was deepening into night around them, warm and familiar and entirely theirs. Myrtle, he said. Someone was always going to look. She turned to him fully then, and in the fading light her eyes were dark and warm and steady, and she reached out and took his hand the way she had taken it on this same porch years ago, in the chair beside him, quietly and definitively. I know that now, she said. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together on the porch of the house she had built, while the stars came out over Texas one by one, and the cedar trees stood dark on the land that was hers, and the lamplight came warm through the window where their children were inside with their grandmother. And Nathan Morgan thought about broken axles and dark roads, and a woman who appeared and disappeared like a star showing itself between clouds. And he thought about the month he had spent finding her, asking questions and driving roads and waiting in a mediocre hotel for a first Saturday, and he thought that he had never done a better piece of work in his life. He had measured a great deal of this state in his years as a surveyor. He had set down distances and elevations and boundaries in precise recorded figures, had mapped land that had never been mapped, had resolved disputes that might otherwise have become violence. He believed in the value of that work. He believed in measurement. But the best thing he had ever done, he thought, the most important and most lasting, was to drive through the cedar trees that morning in April 1878 because something in him could not drive on without knowing who had fixed the broken axle. That had been the decision that mattered. The rest had followed. And the rest was this: the porch, the evening, the warm hand in his, the children inside, the cedar trees, the mockingbird, the lamplight, the stars. The rest was home. Myrtle said quietly, not lifting her head from his shoulder, I was thinking. The apple orchard is going to start producing in another year, maybe two. If it does as well as I think it will, we'll need to hire additional help. We can do that, he said. Pablo's younger brother is looking for steady work, she said. He's a good worker, Pablo says. Then we'll talk to him. She nodded against his shoulder. And I was thinking, the larder in the townhouse is still not quite right. I want to rebuild the shelving. I'll get the lumber, he said. I can get the lumber myself, she said, precisely as he expected her to. I know it, he said, but I'd like to help. She was quiet for a moment. All right, she said. We'll get the lumber together. He held her hand and she leaned against him, and the evening settled around them like a blanket, and neither of them said anything else for a while, because there was nothing that needed saying, and they were the kind of people who understood that silence had its own language and its own weight, and this silence was the comfortable, full kind. The kind that only exists between people who know each other all the way down, who have stood in the dark and the light together and found each other solid. The mockingbird went through its repertoire 3 times before they went inside, and the stars were fully out by then, thick and brilliant over the cedar brakes, the way they always are in Texas in the fall, a sky so enormous and so deep that it makes a person feel simultaneously very small and very much held. Nathan held the door for Myrtle as she went in, and she gave him a look for it that he had learned to read as affectionate, and he smiled, and she smiled back, and they went inside where the children and the lamplight were. In the years that followed, the Morgan family became a fixture in Hargrove Crossing and along the Cedar Creek Road. Nathan continued his survey work, building a reputation for precision and fairness that spread through the county and beyond. And when the county grew and the survey office expanded, he trained 2 young men in the work and taught them what the old man in Tennessee had taught him, that measuring land precisely was a form of justice, and you could not do it well if you were careless with the truth. He was a man of standing in the community, which he wore lightly because he had no patience for the kind of standing that required you to forget where you came from. Myrtle's apple orchard came into full production in the fall of 1884, and it was everything she had planned, a row of productive trees that she managed with the same complete attention she gave everything, and the apples she sold at the Hargrove crossing market were a significant source of income and the source of a certain justified pride. She was not someone who was comfortable accepting praise, but she did not refuse it when it was given plainly and for good reason, and people in Hargrove Crossing said that Myrtle Morgan's apple orchard was the best thing to come out of Cedar Creek since anyone could remember. She also began, in those years, to write. She had always written letters well and with clarity, but she began writing longer things, observations about farming and plant management, recorded in a neat journal, and then occasionally pieces for the Hargrove Crossing Gazette, the small weekly paper that had come to the town in 1880, about practical matters of farm management, and occasionally about larger things, water rights, the question of what was owed to the land and to the people who had been here before. The editor printed them, not always without some negotiation about the more direct observations, and Myrtle was read by people up and down the county with reactions that ranged from enthusiastic agreement to considerable outrage, both of which she regarded as evidence that she was saying something worth hearing. James grew into a boy who was, as Nathan had suspected from very early, exactly his mother, methodical, observant, with a dry humor that appeared around age 5 and never left. He had Nathan's interest in how things worked and Myrtle's refusal to accept easy answers, which made him formidably good at school and occasionally challenging for his teachers. Nathan taught him to survey land on summer afternoons when James was old enough to manage the equipment, and James took to it with a seriousness that was touching and somewhat amusing in a 9-year-old. Clara was a force of nature who filled every room she entered with a quantity of ideas and observations that would have exhausted a lesser household, but which her parents received with the patience and attention they had always applied to anything worth taking seriously, which in their view was most things. She decided at age 6 that she wanted to be a doctor, revised this at age 7 to a doctor and a writer, and had not substantially changed this position since, which doctor. Marsh, who had become a family friend over the years, said he entirely supported. Henrietta Talbot came up from Careville twice a year, and Robert Talbot came once, and he sat on the porch of the Cedar Creek farmhouse and talked to Nathan about land and water, and the way the country was changing, and Nathan listened with the respect that Robert Talbot had earned through a lifetime of honest work and honest thought. When Robert Talbot died in 1886, peacefully and in his own bed, Nathan sat Shiva with the family in Careville. They were not Jewish, but the phrase for it seemed right, sitting with grief, being present, and held Myrtle while she cried, which she allowed, which was her way of trusting him completely. Henrietta Talbot came to live with them after that, moving into the Cedar Creek farmhouse, which made it practical sense for Myrtle to spend more time there, and Nathan found that his pattern of life shifted naturally, more time at the farm, riding into town for his survey office work during the day, coming home in the evenings to the farmhouse with its solid stone walls and its climbing roses and its apple orchard and its chickens, and the mule Biscuit, who was old now but still righteously displeased about anything that disturbed his routine. In the evenings Nathan sometimes sat on the porch alone for a few minutes before going in, when the light was the right angle on the cedar trees and the air had the particular quality it gets in fall, and he thought about roads and accidents and the improbable things that determine a life. A wagon axle, weakest where you cannot see, a lantern burning in the dark, a woman who went out in the night without hesitation, did what needed doing and went home. He had built his life around this place. Around her. He did not think this was a small thing or a sentimental one. He thought it was the most precisely accurate measurement he had ever taken, the measure of something real and lasting, set down in the record of their days together with all the care he brought to work that mattered. One evening when he came into the kitchen from his porch time, Myrtle was at the table writing something, and she did not look up immediately, and he stood for a moment in the doorway looking at her. The lamp on the table, her dark hair still thick though there was some gray at the temples now that she regarded without distress, her handwriting moving across the paper with the decisiveness of someone who knows what they want to say. The kitchen smelled of the apple cake she had made that afternoon and of wood smoke and of something green from the garden, and from somewhere in the back of the house he could hear Henrietta telling Clara a story and James's voice asking a question about something, and the whole texture of the house alive around them. Myrtle looked up and found him in the doorway. "You're doing it again," she said. "Doing what?" "Standing in doorways looking at things." "I'm a surveyor," he said. "I observe things carefully." "You've been observing me from doorways for 6 years," she said. "What conclusions have you reached?" He considered this. He came to the table and sat down and folded his hands on the surface, and he looked at her with all the attention he had, the attention he brought to good work, careful and full and honest. "That I found the most remarkable thing in this territory," he said, "on a road in the dark in the middle of the night by pure accident and the grace of a broken axle, and that every mile I drove to find it again was the best survey work I ever did." She looked at him across the table, and her eyes were warm and sure and entirely herself, and she said, "Nathan Morgan, you are occasionally almost poetic." "Almost," he agreed. She reached across the table and covered his hands with hers, and he turned his hands over and held on, and the lamp burned steadily between them. And outside the cedar trees stood dark on the land that was theirs, and the stars were coming out over Texas, and everything was whole.